It is game day on Gamecock Central Radio. Emerson Phillips with Wes Mitchell will be joined on today's Game Day podcast by Chris Clark, by Collyn Taylor, and by Radi Nabulsi from UGAsports.com. Wes, big ball game, man. You know, I don't think anybody at the start of the season would have guessed that Georgia, South Carolina would have such big implications in the SEC East. And from a Gamecock perspective, man, it sure is nice to be involved in a huge ball game early in November in the SEC East standings.
Yeah, you know, I think it in some ways feels a little bit like, you know, that stretch from about 2010 through 2013 or so, where these two teams sort of were battling for the SEC East. Even before South Carolina actually won the East in 2010, you had several years there where South Carolina was in the conversation. There's been a lot of close football games between these two teams going all the way back to 2000 when South Carolina beat Georgia at home under Lou Holtz. You look at all those games, a couple of blowouts for Georgia at home, you know, a blowout in there for South Carolina at home. But for the most part, these games, even when one team has been, quote, better than the other, these games have remained relatively close. So I'm very, very curious to see what happens this afternoon. It's a true test for South Carolina. And as I'm sure we're going to talk about, a massive line on this game. So in some ways, it feels like a little bit like what we got accustomed to following this South Carolina team for a while there. But in other ways, I think especially people outside of Columbia are still saying, okay, the records are close right now. Statistically, mathematically, South Carolina is still in this race. But I think, especially in Vegas, they don't quite believe that the Gamecocks are to that point where they're going to actually contend for the East. And I think later on today we're going to find out just how much progress this program has made since Will Muschamp took over.
All right, South Carolina and Georgia between the bushes today over in Athens, 3:30 kickoff. It'll be a national TV ball game on CBS. And the Gamecocks are 6-2 overall, 4-2 in the SEC, and Georgia comes in 8-0, and they're 5-0 in SEC play. They can clinch the SEC East with a win today and a Kentucky loss. And West, you know, big news in Athens this week is the fact that Georgia comes in with the first release of the college football playoff rankings. Georgia ranked number 1 in the nation in those rankings that came out on Tuesday night, and I think that was something that a lot of Georgia fans were hoping that they would get. They felt like they deserved to have it, and I know the only playoff rankings that matter are the last ones that come out before the start of bowl season, but a feather in the cap of Georgia. Georgia fans expect to be in the national championship hunt. They really haven't been in that conversation for 10 years or more. So I think that was a big story in Athens. Georgia number 1 in the nation in the college football playoff rankings.
Yeah, and you can kind of see Emerson, Kirby Smart kind of trying to fight this thing almost. Like I'm sure the fans all wanted to be number 1, but you know, you can see coaches like Nick Saban before they came out using the word poison, talking about you know, these rankings at this point in the year. And you know, Alabama Saban's probably not mad at all that Alabama's number 2 because he can kind of use that as motivation. But I think, you know, you hear Georgia talking about I heard Radi talking about on UGAsports.com that Georgia basically doesn't even acknowledge it. You know, they say they don't even look at that stuff, which I don't believe for a second. You look at this fan base, they're all excited. They're as fired up as they've been in a long time. If you can say anything about this game that maybe does point in South Carolina's favor, Emerson, I think it's just the timing of it. You look last week, everybody knows how big the cocktail party is to both Georgia and Florida. You come off a game where you just hammer your rival. Then next week, you have what is going to be another sort of top 25 national implications type game with Auburn on deck. That's a rival for Georgia as well. If anything, this does kind of come at a good time for the Gamecocks. At least the Georgia fan base really seems to be feeling themselves right now, and they're feeling pretty invincible. If there's one thing I've learned about college football, it is that no team is invincible, and that every team, even championship teams, have a letdown or two that they have to survive. So on paper, I see exactly why Georgia's favored by so much. But I think if it's South Carolina, the Gamecocks got to play their best game of the year. and they need to hope that this is Georgia's sort of one or two letdowns this year, because to their credit, Georgia really hasn't had that sort of letdown game yet this year.
No, they haven't, and they really have not been tested all year, with the exception of the second game of the season when they went up to South Bend and beat Notre Dame in that 1-point ball game, and that was Jake Fromm's first start. Interesting situation with the Georgia quarterbacks, Wes. I want to get into that today, and I think any conversation of the Georgia Bulldogs this year obviously starts with their running game. So let's start with a conversation about that, Wes. Georgia averaging 284 yards a game running the football. Nick Chubb has run for 765. Sonny Michel, 629. Chubb's got 9 TDs on the year, and they've even got another couple of backs that can come in and run the ball very effectively. So Georgia's got a loaded stable of running backs, and they're running behind a very big and athletic offensive line. The run game is Georgia's calling card, Wes, and nobody has been able to slow them down all year. Nobody. And we saw what Georgia did to Florida in the cocktail party last week. Georgia just beat the breath out of the Gators down in Jacksonville last Saturday, and that was kind of typical of the way the season has gone for Georgia. 42-7, they whipped Florida. They were up 21-0 in a blink of an eye. Big plays from Chubb and Michel in the running game, and they only threw 7 passes last week. That was by far the fewest that Georgia has thrown in a single game since the Vince Dooley era. This is a run-first football team without question, but you can't get confused by that, because while Georgia is last in the SEC in passing, he's one of the conference's leaders in passing efficiency. So the simple fact of the matter is Georgia has not had to throw the football much this year because they're running people over on the ground.
Yeah, they've not had to throw the football, but I think they can throw the football. To start out, everybody talks about, obviously, Nick Chubb and then Sonny Michel, but, man, I look at DeAndre Swift, who is their freshman and sort of their third back. This kid is probably just as good or close to being as good as those other two, and I think has a bright future. Chubb is sort of the guy to me that almost lulls you to sleep as a defense, and he's going to just hammer away at you. I think a big key for South Carolina, when you get to that guy, you have to find a way to wrap him up. He's very, very strong. He's got strong legs, but he's got great balance as well. So you look at him, several times he'll appear to be down, but then find a way to keep his balance and keep on carrying guys, and he doesn't exactly remind me running style wise of Marcus Lattimore, but the results is similar how Lattimore would always sort of fall forward for 1 or 2 yards extra, and that adds up over a game. Then you look at Sonny Michel. These guys, he and Swift, are more kind of your outside runners, but they still run them inside, but I think a key for South Carolina is their backside pursuit and filling off those edges, because a lot of times Georgia will have an inside run called, I've noticed, and they'll sort of bend it to the outside or cut it outside. And if your defenders have gotten sucked up inside, there's huge rooms out, there's huge amounts of room out there on the perimeter. And once you get these guys out there, very, very tough to stop because they are so fast, they are so elusive. So, I look at those things. It really is going to be a game that I think tests South Carolina mentally and physically on defense, because, they'll sort of lull you to sleep, and the next thing you know, they're breaking off a 50-yard run. So South Carolina fans are going to have to endure 7, 6, 8, 9-yard runs. And actually, in the grand scheme, it's weird to say, but you might be okay with that at times, because you've got to keep them from getting those true explosive plays that change field position or change the scoreboard. So I think that's a key right there for South Carolina against the running game. And then Jake Fromm, this kid doesn't have to throw much, but when you start putting guys into the box, as teams have to, then what does that create for you? Either creates one-on-one on the outside if you're in man coverage, or it creates those big cushions on the outside if you're in zone coverage. So that leads to easier throws for Fromm, and he's been more than willing to take that. They only had to throw it 7 times against Florida, but when other teams have either forced Fromm to throw or when Georgia's just decided to throw, like you said, man, he's been very, very efficient with the football.
Yep. And another interesting facet to that Florida-Georgia game last Saturday, Wes, Georgia ran 42 plays on offense, and they scored 42 points in the ball game. So their offense is running at peak efficiency right now because you have to choose your poison with them. Good example of that, Wes. Wow. Missouri tried to stack the box against Georgia. I think Missouri went in saying, all right, if we can limit this running game, let's see if Jake Fromm can beat us. And Fromm threw for over 300 yards in that game. Georgia rolled up a bunch of points in that game and whipped Missouri. So you really kind of choose your poison when you're devising a defensive game plan to face the Georgia Bulldogs. I don't know what the answer is, Wes, and we're going to see what T-Rob and Will Muschamp and the Gamecock staff come up with today. Interesting that when Muschamp was a player at Georgia, Kirby Smart came in. I believe Muschamp was a senior when Smart was a freshman. So these two know each other quite well. Radi Nabulsi, who is from UGAsports.com and did a podcast earlier this week giving us the Georgia perspective here on Gamecock Central Radio, he said that Will Muschamp probably knows Kirby Smart better than anybody. So, maybe Muschamp and T-Rob and the Gamecock staff can come up with something to slow Georgia down in a way that nobody has done it this year, but it sure seems like a tall order, Wes.
Yeah, it's a very tall order, man, and I think the thing, and when we get to our Gamecock hotline, we have a question about this. In fact, if since we're on it, we can go ahead and go to it right here, Emerson, if you want. But about the running game, you want to go ahead and go to that since it sort of matches in with what we're talking about?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's go ahead and check in with Seth from Greenville, who called us this week on the Gamecock Central hotline. It's a new feature we've got, and we invite you to call the hotline and take part in our podcast. All you do is call the number, 803-497-9058. It's 803-497-9058. You leave us a voicemail, and we're going to play your message on a future Game Day edition of Gamecock Central Radio. And right now, I think Seth from Greenville has got the question of the day. This is the $64,000 question, Wes, and we'll throw it over to Seth from Greenville right now on the Gamecock Central hotline.
Hey, guys, this is Seth from Greenville. I just had a question about the Georgia game this weekend. Do you think we can actually, load the box, put 7-8 guys in the box to stop the run and get away with doing that against Fromm? Or do you think that, Fromm has the ability to take advantage of man coverage and, beat us, throughout the game, throughout a 4-quarter game through the air? I know we're not going to completely shut their run game down, but obviously, if you put 7-8 guys in the box, it's going to make them think and make them throw the ball just a little bit more than they want to. Do you think that's the Gamecocks' best chance to win, and do you think Fromm can beat the Gamecocks with his arm through 4 quarters? Thank you.
All right, thanks for the call, Seth. Wes, that really is the question coming into this game. I mean, that sums up the entire Game Day podcast that we're doing today, the question that Seth asked.
Yeah, and Emerson, I think it is very easy to talk about, South Carolina has to stack the box and stop the run to win the game. But it is much more difficult to actually do. Every team Georgia has played, I'm sure, has brought an extra player into the box and played with a single high safety. Mm-hmm. The problem with that is that Georgia can still run the football, and then you make it way easier on them to throw the football too. So, I think if you're South Carolina, in theory you have to stack the box, but at times, you don't want to make it pitch and catch either. Your defense is at its best when it can stop the run without putting an extra defender into the box. Now, South Carolina, they do play a lot of single high safety, which means that second safety is up in the box anyway, so I'm sure we're going to see a ton of that. I think the key for Carolina defensively, other than those things we talked about, wrapping up all the way until the ball carries to the ground, making sure you stick with your keys and that the guys who are supposed to set the edge still set the edge. I think another key, as far as the defensive game plan standpoint, is they're going to have to mix up their front and give Georgia a bunch of different looks, because this team isn't going to just line up and stop Georgia's running game. I think you have to have enough sort of manufactured negative plays where maybe you switch something up and get them in the backfield and get them in second long, get them in third long. You have to have enough of those manufactured situations where you can get Georgia off schedule. But then, even then, something South Carolina has been hit or miss on. Emerson is getting pressure on the quarterback on third down in those passing situations. So I think if South Carolina is able to stop the run on first and second down and get into a third and long, then you still have to find a way to actually get off the field because, like I said, man, I think this Jake Fromm kid, he's a former 5-star. I think he's a better quarterback, really, than anybody's giving him credit for. So to answer Seth's question, yeah, to all those things, South Carolina has to do all those things. But we'll see from an X's and O's standpoint, that's what they have to do. But from a Jimmy's and Joe's standpoint, on the field, can they actually make it work? I don't know. That's part of the reason that Georgia is such a big favorite in this game is what they have talent-wise is just, I think, easily top 3, top 4 in the country. And these guys are veterans, too. Jake Fromm's a freshman, but the rest of these guys are all veterans.
Yeah, you know, that's one thing Will Muschamp talked about in his Tuesday press conference this week. He was talking about, you know, Fromm had a bit of an advantage because so many of these Georgia offensive players had been in the system a year or 2 or 3, and he was not having to tell backs in the backfield, you know, where to go, pre-snap and all this. So Muschamp was saying that he thought Fromm's job was made a little bit easier by the fact that there's a lot of experience on that Georgia offense, and he was not detracting from anything that Jake Fromm has done or is capable of doing this year. He was simply pointing out the fact that, and he was kind of contrasting Fromm with Jake Bentley from a year ago. You know, Jake had so many fellow freshmen on the offense with him. He said all those guys were kind of learning together last year, and Fromm was in a different situation this year, and a bit of, a situation that was beneficial to him and to the Georgia offense. So Georgia red hot right now. That's why they got voted number 1 in the college football playoff rankings that came out Tuesday night, and a lot of excitement around Georgia football in Athens right now. Wes, you know, I think it would be easy to look at this and say, well, maybe Georgia is caught up in the fact that they're ranked number 1 in the polls for the first time in a long time. Actually, number 2 in the AP, but number 1 in the college football playoff rankings. But, you know, that's been a hot topic in Athens, and I think it would be easy to look at that and say, well, that could be a distraction for Georgia. Maybe they're worried about rankings and not worried about, you know, what's going to happen on the field on Saturday. But, you know, I get the feeling that playing at home, West, they can't clinch the East today, but they can put themselves on the cusp of clinching a trip to Atlanta. Radi Nabulsi from UGAsports.com said that's the reason Mark Richt got fired. He could not get this team to Atlanta on a consistent basis. So for Kirby Smart to have Georgia on the cusp of clinching a trip to Atlanta, that's obviously a huge deal. I don't think there's any chance for a Georgia letdown today, as much as we'd like that to happen from a Gamecock perspective. I just think Georgia comes in with all guns blazing today, and it's going to take a very good Gamecock effort to make this a football game, much less come out of Athens with a win. So, Wes, before we turn our attention to the point spread, which I think is an interesting discussion in and of itself, and, you know, it has no impact on the game, obviously, but kind of gives you an idea about, you know, what the betting public is thinking about coming into the game. I wanted you to talk about Georgia quarterbacks a little bit more. Eason was named the starter going into the season, and he got hurt in the season opener. Fromm got his first start at Notre Dame, and Georgia has won every game this year. So, you know, Eason's healthy now. You were telling me before we started the podcast that Eason has been back for a while, but Fromm has done nothing to merit losing the job. In fact, quite the opposite. He's been outstanding. So, you know, quite an enviable situation that Georgia's in, having not one but 2 outstanding quarterbacks.
Yeah, and then they've got a kid and Justin Fields coming in this next season, next class, that actually is another 5-star. So, Emerson, that's 3 5-stars in a row by the Rivals rankings, which is ridiculous. But, yeah, you know, Eason, much like Jake Bentley, played as a true freshman last year, came in as a starter this year. But, you know, I already had the impression that Fromm was kind of pushing him in practice, even, you know, freshman versus veteran sophomore. But as is almost always the case, if it's pretty close, you know, you go with the guy who's been there before in your season opener. So that was the case. Eason got hurt. Eason has gotten back now. He is available. I was looking. I think he's played, you know, to an extent in maybe 3 of their games since he came back. So he's been in there. But Fromm is the guy right now. You look at the way this team has rallied around the kid. I think if you're undefeated, as with Fromm playing as well as he has, you don't make that move, and I understand why. This kid is very, very good, and he's kind of handled the pressure as well. I think of being the guy, the true freshman. I look, it's very easy to say. Even one of the Florida DBs was saying that, he's throwing simple slant passes. Well, you know what? I look at when Jake Fromm does pass the football, even his short passes, where do they hit his receiver? And most of the time, the balls are chest high, and that he hits them in stride. They have Javon Wims, a big receiver target on the outside. He's about 6'4". Actually took an official visit to South Carolina during the recruiting process. A kid I interviewed out of junior college. He sort of is that go up and get it target. And you watch the Florida game, Fromm did an excellent job on one touchdown pass of getting the ball up and putting it where only Wims could catch it. On another play, they went back shoulder. So, and Wims was able to slow up, and the DB sort of overran the ball. Completion for a big play. You look at sort of where Fromm puts the football, and to me, he's a better player than just that game manager tag gets placed on guys. To me, he's better than that. Now, like we all have been saying the whole time, the kid does have weapons all the way around him. That's very true, but he does a great job of distributing the football to these weapons. And then, hey, man, add all this stuff we're talking about, and then throw in the fact they have a quarterback's best friend, which is great tight ends. Georgia, for as long as I can remember, has had great tight ends. That's the case now. They have depth at tight end. And then they hit their running backs in the passing game as well, which makes for easy throws for the quarterback. They get those guys out on the edge in space. It's a lot for a defense to have to account for.
All right, so Wes, we'll talk about the point spread later in the podcast here. I just thought that's interesting the way Georgia's a huge favorite in this game, and the number actually went up as soon as it was released, and it's come back down a little bit. So we'll get to that in just a moment, but I think we need to show some love to the Georgia defense as well. All this talk about the Georgia running game, but the Georgia defense has been among the best in the country. And all you got to do is look at that Notre Dame game early in the season. Notre Dame has run for over 300 yards on every opponent. They actually had a 400-yard rushing effort in one game, and Georgia shut them down. Georgia went to South Bend and gave up just 55 yards on the ground, Wes. So, some people say maybe they're a little bit susceptible in pass defense. Maybe the Gamecocks can throw on Georgia today, but Georgia's defense has been one of the best units in the nation.
Yeah, and they have. They have stopped the run. They've been outstanding in that standpoint. And you look at them, it's not easy, or it's not difficult, I should say, to see why. I almost hate to say it this quickly. It's only year two, but this Georgia defense has started to play like an Alabama defense. Obviously Kirby Smart running the Alabama defense for so many years under Nick Saban. We talked earlier this year, and it's not quite the same from an athleticism standpoint. We talked earlier this year how South Carolina's defense was starting to take on sort of the personality of T-Rob and Will Muschamp. I feel like this Georgia defense, just the way they play, the way they attack, they look like an Alabama defense, and they have great athleticism up front, all across the board in their front seven. Roquan Smith is probably their best player. He's an inside linebacker that has a lot of speed, athleticism, is also big enough. Then you look at Lorenzo Carter. He's their best pass rusher off the edge. Another kid Carolina recruited early on, but didn't really take a huge look at the Gamecocks. He's sort of that prototypical outside edge rusher that's going to line up at outside linebacker and lined up with his hand in the ground at defensive end. It's a really good front, man, and that's where it all starts. They put you in situations where you can't run the football on first and second down, and then they get you in third and long. Now, this defense has not sacked teams as much as you would think comparatively to their athleticism, but because they've been so good at stopping the run, it really hasn't hurt them. So I think if you're South Carolina, much the way a pitcher sometimes has to pitch backwards, I think you have to call this game backwards. You have to go against tendency. You have to throw the football when they're expecting to run. You have to run when they're expecting to pass, and you have to get yourself in positive situations. I think you look at what Alabama's defense they're built on, Alabama always has great cornerbacks, great secondary play. I don't know if Georgia quite has that level of caliber of player on the outside as an Alabama does, but yet they still play very, very aggressively, man. These guys, they're going to mix coverages. They're going to shift their coverage at the last second at the snap so that you don't know what they're in. Very, very well coached. You can tell they're in their second year in this system, and they're very strong with the football. If there's one thing I'll watch, especially at home with a rabid fan base out there, do the officials let them sort of grab on? Do they let them get away with stuff, or are they going to call it sort of ticky-tack as we've seen at times? I think that would be a key because when the ball is in the air, they're going to fight you all the way to the ground. South Carolina's receivers going to have to be very, very strong with the football and man coverage because there's going to be a lot of opportunities, I think, where Jake Bentley gives his receivers a chance, and these Georgia DBs will just get very, very physical with the ball, even if it looks like you have a catch. So I think that's the key to watch, sort of that moment that is the difference between a 15-yard completion or a pass interference and just a typical regular old incomplete pass. I think those plays will be a big key to this game.
This is Gamecock Central's Game Day podcast, and we got a border war today between the Gamecocks and the Bulldogs, a 3:30 kick over in Athens. It's at Sanford Stadium, national TV game on CBS. Emerson Phillips with Wes Mitchell here. We hope you've downloaded the Gamecock Central radio app. We got this free phone app that allows you to listen to our podcast on your cell phone or mobile device. You can get the app for free on the App Store and on Google Play. Then you can subscribe to our podcast. Search for Gamecock Central Radio on iTunes, SoundCloud, and other popular services, or just visit radio.GamecockCentral.com. And be sure to take advantage of the Gamecock Central hotline. We heard from Seth from Greenville earlier today. He took advantage of the GC hotline. That number is 803-497-9058, 497-9058. Call in, leave us a voice message about the Gamecock football team, or if you have a question about an upcoming opponent. Questions, comments, feedback. We welcome your input on the GC hotline, 803-497-9058. Get involved with the Gamecock Central podcast. Wes, a lot of connections between these two teams, as you would expect, Georgia and South Carolina. The Gamecocks have got 24 players on the roster who are from the state of Georgia. Will Muschamp, obviously, is a Georgia alum. And Brian McClendon, the Gamecock assistant coach, was interim head coach at Georgia when Mark Richt got fired, and McClendon actually led Georgia to a bowl win as the Bulldogs interim coach. So a lot of ties between these two programs. They know each other very well. In fact, the Gamecocks have faced only one opponent more than they faced Georgia, and that's Clemson. Carolina and Georgia meeting today for the 70th time. And Wes, I was looking at some of the game notes this week, and this is the 37th meeting all-time in Athens, and the Gamecocks have won just 8 times over between the hedges. So we know Georgia's a tough place to go play and win. Some of South Carolina's biggest wins in the history of the program have been wins at Georgia, but there haven't been very many of them. So let's talk about what the Gamecocks are going to have to do today to try to find a way to win.
Yeah, like you said, a lot of connections at the two schools. You know Will Muschamp doesn't want to start 0-2 against his buddy Kirby, although I think anybody in their right mind would give you that they took over two very, very different programs and much more of a rebuild job for Muschamp here at South Carolina. But, what does South Carolina have to do? I think first and foremost, and we say this a lot, but it's true, they have to start pretty fast in the first place. I think just even if you don't start fast, I think at the very least, survive the first quarter, Emerson. If I look at what Georgia's done this year, other than that Notre Dame game that we talked about earlier, and that was very early in the year, and that was, like you said, that's Jake Fromm's first career start. So they were very, very conservative in what they did with him on the road, as you would expect. They played with a lead for pretty much the entire season, and at times very big leads. They jumped all over Florida last week, and Florida went for it on some fourth downs, which if they hit them, maybe they stay in the game a little bit, but they didn't hit them. So then, you're getting nothing instead of 3 points or 7. And they just basically took Florida out of the game from the very beginning. If you give this team that early advantage when they're built around physical, running the football and shortening the game in the first place, you don't really stand a chance. I mean, let's be honest, because then you really have to key in on the run, and then they can play action you and hit those big tight ends and hit their, big receivers on the outside. You play right into their hands, man. So I think for South Carolina, survive the first quarter, get into the flow of the game, make Georgia play 4 quarters. They haven't had to do that. South Carolina, on the other hand, has been in fourth quarter games since Will Muschamp arrived. They're used to it. They're used to a game coming down to one series or one play even. Kirby Smart, for that matter, still a young head coach. He's not used to making a bunch of his late game decisions like that. So even if South Carolina's outmanned, make it a fourth quarter game, then I think you go to the other stuff we always talk about, man. Turnovers are the great equalizer. Red zone offense and defense are the great equalizers. Score touchdowns, force field goals. You're talking about, I think, in these games where South Carolina is such a big underdog, so many things have to go their way. Everything's got to go their way. But, hey, you know what? That's why you play the game. And, I think for South Carolina, they don't need to let the moment be too big, because really South Carolina doesn't have anything to lose in this. So I think offensively, like I said earlier, call plays backwards. I expect Carolina to have a creative game plan. I expect this. We saw wrinkles against Vanderbilt.
Yep.
I detailed some of those in my tell of the tape. I expect more of that today. I expect the South Carolina offense to flash new plays, new wrinkles, new looks, throw the kitchen sink at Georgia, because really that's their only chance. And finally, Emerson, I know you mentioned earlier, and I thought it was a good point, that nobody knows Kirby Smart like Will Muschamp. I think that's an advantage for South Carolina when South Carolina is on offense, which to me, it might sound a little backwards at first, but nobody knows that Kirby Smart defense, probably other than maybe Nick Saban, more than Will Muschamp. And I think when you look at that defense and the rules to how they play certain coverages, the keys to what coverage they're in, sort of who passes off who in certain zone coverages, Muschamp should be able to pick those things out and help out his quarterback and help out the offensive staff in trying to figure out if this defense has a weakness. There may not be many weaknesses in this defense, to be honest. They're veteran up front. They're long. They're athletic. They can run. They run to the football very, very well. It's a tough matchup. Let's be honest. Pretty much everything has to go South Carolina's way for them to win this game. But if all those things I just talked about go their way, then you're going to have one of the biggest upsets of the college football season.
Wes, let me ask you this. When Steve Spurrier resigned at midseason a couple of years ago and Sean Elliott was named the interim head coach, at the end of that year, Ray Tanner and the Gamecock administration began its search in earnest for a permanent replacement to be the head coach of the Gamecock football program. And Kirby Smart was a name that was mentioned, as one of the favorites for the job. And Muschamp obviously was hired. So do you know, Wes, how much consideration did Kirby Smart get for the Carolina job? Because at the time it felt like, Georgia kind of made a hasty decision to go ahead and get rid of Mark Richt and hire Kirby Smart. How much in the running was Kirby Smart for the Carolina job? Do you know?
Yeah, he was right there, man. I would go as far as to say if Georgia had not gotten rid of Mark Richt, then there's a very real chance that Kirby Smart would be South Carolina's head coach right now. Depending on who you talk to, it's out there. I say the word rumor, but I also would say strongly rumored that Georgia made the move because South Carolina was about to make the move.
Yeah.
And, coaches don't go from one SEC East team to another. So if you're Georgia and you always thought Kirby Smart was going to be your coach one day, that window was closing quickly. So they acted fast. They made the move. And frankly, and I was very critical of it, frankly, it's probably worked out for all parties. I think that Kirby Smart, obviously sitting pretty right now. They're number one in the country. although I still am waiting for karma to get him for ousting Mark Richt after so long and so many good seasons. But, hey, Mark Richt, I think, is having the time of his life down in Miami. They've played very, very well. They're still undefeated as well.
Yep.
So that's worked out for them. And I tend to think Will Muschamp has proved to be the perfect coach for South Carolina. A blue-collar guy. This is his second opportunity, his second chance that, he's not going to be outworked. South Carolina, to me, a lot of this stuff is about fit. Florida, Jim McElwain, not really a fit. Those guys want high-flying, exciting offense. South Carolina, when the Gamecocks have been their best, have played tough-nosed, blue-collar defense as an underdog program. And to me, that mentality fits what Will Muschamp is to a T. So it's kind of interesting how all of those situations, Mark Richt, Kirby Smart, Will Muschamp, all of them have kind of worked out, I think, for the best.
Wes, I got the impression when Georgia got rid of Richt and hired Kirby Smart, and I have not spoken with Ray Tanner. I don't have this on any authority, but I got the impression that when it started to look like South Carolina had a chance with Kirby Smart, Georgia went ahead and got rid of Richt, and they cock-blocked the Gamecocks. Man, they jumped in on Kirby Smart because they knew they could get him, and they made some quick decisions to try to get him in there, and that worked out for them, and I think it worked out well for the Gamecocks as well. I agree with you. I think Will Muschamp was just the right man at just the right time for South Carolina, but I've always wondered about that. How close was Kirby Smart to possibly being offered the South Carolina job, and because it sure looked to me like when it looked like Carolina, was in position maybe to get Smart, Georgia acted very quickly to move in and get him themselves. So that's an interesting part of this game as well. The Muschamp and Kirby Smart angle, the fact that they played together 1 year at Georgia and they know each other extremely well from Muschamp's time as defensive coordinator at Auburn, plus a couple of other stops, and the fact that Kirby Smart was the defensive coordinator at Alabama. These two coaches know each other extremely well. And the two programs obviously go way back. So it's just a great matchup. Latest in the calendar that the Gamecocks and Bulldogs have faced one another since 1939. And Wes, starting next year, the Georgia-South Carolina game will move back to the first month of the season, which is where it was, really since the Gamecocks joined the SEC in the early 90s. Only in the last couple of years had the game been moved back on the schedule, but next year it goes back to early September.
Yeah, and I kind of like that traditional sort of early game matchup because it sets. There was a time for a stretch there where it sort of set the stage for the East, at least as far as those two teams are concerned. And if you win that game, you got a little bit of a head start. If you lose that game, then you're schedule watching the rest of the way. So I like it there, but. Hey, there's been some memorable matchups for South Carolina late against Georgia too. I mean, the 2012 35-7 beatdown that South Carolina put on Georgia, that was a late game, and that allowed both teams to go ahead and sort of put together good records. Both teams came into that game, undefeated, I think. So, if this game was earlier in the year, then it wouldn't have a chance to be an 8-0, 6-2. CBS matchup. So it's pretty interesting. I think, again, man, South Carolina doesn't really have a whole lot to lose in this game. I think from a recruiting standpoint, they do probably want to keep it close and not have it be a complete blowout. But it really is a great opportunity for them to show that they've maybe closed the gap a bit in the East.
Wes, I think it's a big deal to get that 3:30 game on CBS. That's the national TV game, and the biggest games in the SEC every year are played at 3:30 on CBS. Interesting note to this game, in that 3:30 time slot, the CBS game, the Gamecocks have played on the road 5 times, and they're 0-5 in that 3:30 slot on CBS. But, Wes, the biggest, one of the biggest wins in Gamecock history was against number 1 Alabama at Williams-Brice back in 2010. That was the 3:30 CBS game as well. So the point being here, Wes, if you want to play big-time football in the SEC, you need to have some 3:30 games on CBS, and the Gamecocks have got one today.
Yeah, you want to be talked about. You want for people to be looking at your game. And, hey, man, the other side of that is those Georgia fans only have half the day to get all liquored up compared to the whole day. There's something about a night game in the SEC that just adds a little bit more. So I think it's still going to be a great crowd, I'm sure. Don't get me wrong. You don't get to watch your team as the number one team in the country all that often. So I'm sure it'll be packed, but like I said, man, start the game. South Carolina needs to just weather that storm, somehow try to keep that crowd from just going off. And that all starts with playing very, very well to start the game, I think.
Yeah, Wes, I like what you said earlier about wrinkles in the Gamecock offensive game plan. Last week against Vanderbilt, we saw Jake Bentley run the football, design runs for Jake Bentley, something he has done very little of this year. Prior to the Vandy game, Kurt Roper and the staff, obviously went into the Vandy game with the purpose or the intent of letting Jake Bentley run the football, and he ran for 55 yards in his first career rushing touchdown and looked good doing it, Wes. So I think that was obviously by design. The Gamecocks have kind of held that part of the offensive game plan. They held it back, until this point in the year where we're late in the season now, and obviously the remaining games on the schedule take on more importance with each win. And to show that wrinkle to Georgia and Florida and Clemson and the rest of the upcoming opponents, I think that was obviously by design. When you got to think about Jake Bentley running the football, that presents a whole other set of problems for your defense as you're game planning for the Gamecock offense. So I thought that was good to see. Roper's gotten a lot of heat for play calling this year. I thought the play calling last week against Vanderbilt was superb.
Yeah, it was very, very good. And I think, we started to see that take on a little bit in the second half against Tennessee. When they were able to get Jake Bentley involved in that zone read game a little bit and design runs, I think it only helps to open up everything else. They actually have implemented, I think you would almost call it a power read type play too, to the outside. They've implemented a couple of counters where it's kind of a little bit of a misdirection before they hit the run, either to the inside or the outside. So even in their blocking schemes, stuff that you might not notice right off the bat when you're watching the game live, when you go back and watch, you see that they've kind of shifted some things around in how they're blocking certain running plays. So I think you look at those things, just throwing, one more thing out there for your opponent to prepare for, and just continuing to add to the system. I think they were very, very, especially last year with so many freshmen, they had to be very vanilla. This year, you're starting. I think the best coaches stack onto what they're doing. You keep stacking on and giving teams new things to look out for. So that's something I'm going to look for South Carolina to continue to do later on today. And it's frankly something they're going to have to do. Some teams, you may feel like you can just line up and beat them. That ain't going to be the case between the hedges this afternoon.
3:30 kick, Gamecocks and Bulldogs, and we're going to welcome in now our Gamecock insider, Chris Clark. He's going to share some thoughts with us on this South Carolina-Georgia game today. Huge matchup in the SEC East. Chris, welcome in.
Always good to be here, Emerson. Thanks for having me.
Hey, good to be with you again, and we appreciate your time. A huge game today, Chris. We've talked about it, Wes and I, today, and wanted to get your thoughts. Big ball game for the Gamecocks in the last month of the regular season with all the injuries the Gamecocks have had. I don't know that anybody thought the Gamecocks would be 6-2 heading to Athens. And, Chris, the one thing that we really haven't touched on so far today is the fact that the Gamecocks' SEC East hopes are still alive. Now, they're obviously going to have to beat Georgia today, and then they'll need Georgia to lose to either Auburn or Kentucky, and Kentucky will have to lose another game. So it's a long shot, but when Deebo Samuel went down in the fourth quarter of that Kentucky game weeks ago, if I'd have told you that the Gamecocks would be headed to Athens with a chance to still win the East, what would you have said?
It wouldn't have seemed extremely likely, and, after we saw this Gamecock team, maybe the first couple games of the season, I remember sending some messages back and forth with Wes and Josh Lowe, who contributes to our site at Gamecock Central too. And we were sort of breaking down the possibilities for this Gamecock team, and we used Athens as that point, saying, look, there is a chance, a possibility that South Carolina could be undefeated going to Athens, or South Carolina could be, say, half and half. And neither would have been a huge surprise. And some people say, Chris, this team being undefeated doesn't even after those first two games wouldn't have seemed possible. But look how they played out. I mean, a relatively close loss to Kentucky at home. That was a bad loss. Game in which Samuel went down. Really just played poorly in that game. And then a game on the road at A&M in which Gamecocks led and did not close out that game, but another close game that came down to the end in the fourth quarter. So, at the same time, some of those other games could have gone the other direction as well. Had some close ball games that they ended up winning. And so, yeah, certainly it's a big accomplishment to already be 6-2 at this point. This is going to be the biggest challenge of the season, really in all facets of the game for the Gamecocks. If you add on the fact that it's on the road, but I think this team and this program has continued to show some progress, and that's a positive thing.
Chris, you're our Gamecock Insider here for Gamecock Central, and you're also a recruiting analyst. And Wes and I talked about the fact that the Gamecocks have 24 players on the roster this year that are from the state of Georgia. The Gamecocks rely heavily on the talent that comes out of Georgia, a very talent-rich state in terms of high school football talent. And, I'm curious to know, how important is the Georgia-South Carolina game from a recruiting standpoint? I don't think recruits look at the result of one game and say, well, I'm going to go here because this team beat that team. But certainly it's got to have an impact in some way, and the recruits do pay attention.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you made a good point. In my years to doing this, I can honestly say I've never heard a prospect that I've covered at least say, South Carolina beat so-and-so team, so I'm going to South Carolina, or South Carolina lost a game against such and such team, I'm not going to South Carolina. It's much more about the bigger picture. And so what USC can tell right now is, look, they turned it around for 3 wins. The new staff came in with a lot of holes and trying to do a lot of things differently, and won 6, got to a bowl game with a young team. And then they're building on that to where they're in position, no guarantees obviously, but in position to build on that win-loss record and continue to build the roster. So you're right, when you're facing off against Georgia, look, this is the number 1 team in the country right now in the college football playoff rankings. So, scoring an upset on the road, or even just acquitting yourself really well, is something that prospects who watch can say, man, South Carolina, this is a program that took the second year of the Will Muschamp era. They're not, and this is no disrespect to anybody on the roster, any of the coaches or anything, this is not as talented or as deep a team as Georgia right now. That's just the bottom line. And that's the case with many of the other programs they recruit against, in their geographical footprint or in the conference. And so that's what they're trying to build up to. So scoring a win or acquitting themselves well, otherwise having a good showing is something that can be an attention getter. For some of the guys in Georgia, or some of the guys around the Southeast, where they could say, here's what South Carolina's been selling, and here's a bit of a tangible result where you can sort of see what they're talking about. It's sort of like when Will Muschamp speaks about his current team, when he says, it's good when these guys can get a win, especially in a close situation, because they've been through a lot. They go through a lot in the off season and in preseason camp, and then in practice, they demand a lot of them. They put in a lot of work, and when they can have a result to point to, it's something that's encouraging. And a similar thing in recruiting. For these coaches, they're going out and selling some past successes, their track records, style of play, academics, all these different things at South Carolina. But you still need to have some wins to point to. And so when you can have that tangible on-field product to point to, that certainly helps your cause in recruiting.
Chris, give us your thoughts on the game today. We've talked about stacking the box. Is that going to help Carolina slow down Georgia's running game? Can Jake Fromm, if he's forced to beat the Gamecocks, will he be able to do it in the fourth quarter if the Gamecocks can stay in it till the fourth? Lots of speculation here, Chris, and it's real easy to say on a podcast on game day, but it's just something different altogether to try to block that Georgia offensive line and try to disrupt their run game, because those backs they've got are so good and their line's so big and so athletic. What kind of scenario do you see giving the Gamecocks a chance to win today, Chris, or are the Gamecocks simply outmanned and Georgia's going to have its way today like they've done all year with everybody else?
Well, and that's the thing. Everybody says, stack the box and make Jake Fromm beat you. Well, if it was that easy, then everybody would have done it, especially a team like Notre Dame. Look, Notre Dame's really good on the lines of scrimmage, both sides of the ball, and after their defense was so bad last season, that's been a striking thing, but that's a different topic for a different day. But they played some teams who have certainly some very capable guys, on the defensive line, and they've handled them, and they'll line up with their regular offensive line, regular package. They'll line up 7 offensive linemen in there sometimes, so they're really going to challenge you, and they can everybody thinks it's just running the ball right up the gut. They do a lot of perimeter runs too. And with a guy like Sony Michel and Nick Chubb and DeAndre Swift and Elijah Holyfield, their fifth-string running back, Brian Herrien, rushed for 9.1 yards a carry against South Carolina last season. So, I mean, they have a stable of backs, and they look more comfortable in the system. Their O-line's playing a lot better. Sam Pittman's a really good position coach. And look, I think there is a bit of a misconception that Georgia can't pass the ball. If they had to rely more on the pass, maybe that would be the case. But they do have some capable receivers. You talk about, Javon Wims and Riley Ridley, Cole Hardman, Terry Godwin. All those guys I mentioned were 4 or 5-star prospects coming out of high school or junior college. In the case of Javon Wims, Jake Fromm, a former 4-star quarterback. And if you look at their stats, they have one of the highest in the country yards per pass completion metrics in the country. So they can hit you with some downfield passes. So it's a tough field to now. Certainly, it starts in terms of stopping the run. Easier said than done. Even if you do stack the box, you can get bounced out of gaps really quickly, miss tackles. So South Carolina have to tackle really well. They're going to have to play their best game in all three phases of the game in order to win this one.
No doubt about it. All right, Chris, enjoy the ball game this weekend, and we look forward to talking more about it with you next week. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Emerson.
And that's Gamecock Insider Chris Clark joining me, Emerson Phillips, and Wes Mitchell on the Gamecock Central Game Day podcast. Wes, fantastic for Carolina to be in this situation with the injuries, and I've said this all week. I'm going to say it again today. With the injuries to Deebo Samuel, to Bryson Allen Williams, and the fact that the Gamecocks have lost 3 different starting offensive linemen, for at least a portion of the season, and they're all back healthy now. But, Wes, when you add all that up, man, I just think it's amazing what this Gamecock team has done. They have persevered. They have found a way to win, minus the services of some of their best players. And to me, that's really the hallmark of what Muschamp and this staff have done together. There seems to be a very positive vibe in the Gamecock locker room. The injuries, while they could have certainly been a legitimate excuse, I think, they have not been an excuse, and this Gamecock team has gotten better as the season has gone on, despite the fact that Deebo and Bryson Allen Williams and others have not been available. So to keep winning without your best players is a sign to me, Wes, that Muschamp's doing a hell of a job this year. And even Steve Spurrier this week said that right now it's Kirby Smart or Will Muschamp for SEC Coach of the Year.
Yeah, I think Spurrier's right. Both guys have sort of exceeded expectations to an extent. And like you said, I think the next man up philosophy that South Carolina has used is great on paper, but it's even better when you can actually do it when guys start going down. So they've been able to do that, even with a team that we didn't think had much depth, Emerson. I think before the year, if you'd have told me that they would lose those guys, I would say there's no way South Carolina's 6-2 at this point. So it's been good. I think that's the difference in building a team versus building a program. If you're building a program, you want for all these very specific characteristics to just be implemented into your program as a whole, sort of be ingrained in the DNA of your program. And I think that's what Will Muschamp is in the process of doing.
All right, let's go ahead now and send it over to Radi Nabulsi from UGAsports.com. He joined us earlier this week on Gamecock Central Radio and brought us the Georgia perspective. That podcast is up on GCR right now. We invite you to check that out. Radi Nabulsi from UGAsports.com gives us Georgia's keys to victory.
The keys for Georgia to win this game are to do what they did against Florida. Kick the ball to the back of the end zone and make South Carolina drive at 75 yards every time against the number 3 defense in the nation. Georgia right now is limiting teams to under 12 points a game. They're going to try to continue that when South Carolina comes to Athens. And they don't want to give up any easy scores. They don't want to give up any short fields. They need to hang on to the ball. You can't let a team like South Carolina get a short field from a fumble or an interception. Ball security will be job one. I know it sounds boring. Coaches say it all the time, but Kirby lives and dies by the mantra of ball security, and it matters in this game. I think another thing Georgia has to do is they're going to have to score. And against South Carolina, it's going to be a little bit tougher than some of the teams they faced in the past, but Georgia's going to have to be able to go through the air and score through the air. They're going to try to line up and run it down their throats like they have everybody else. But I really think that in this game, Georgia's going to need to go to the air and actually score a couple of times that way instead of just trying to run it. Those are the keys of the game.
That's Radi Nabulsi from UGAsports.com, and we'll now give it to Collyn Taylor, Gamecock Central staff writer, who's got Gamecock keys to victory.
We talk every week about South Carolina having to run the ball and stop the run to win, but it's no different this week. I mean, I think, South Carolina really wants to make Drake Farm beat them and make Georgia a really one-dimensional team, take away the ground game, which is easier said than done. But I think they do that and just Bentley can, have some time to throw, and the ground game kind of does what it's been doing for the past three games. South Carolina has a chance to win. I just think it's going to be really hard to obviously stop that two-headed rushing attack and get up the field and make those tackles. But if they can do that, I think South Carolina's got a good shot at winning this game.
All right, there you have it, Wes. That was Collyn Taylor giving us Gamecock keys to victory. The table is now set, and we're all about to sit down and eat. Wes, this is going to be fun. Gamecocks and Dogs, an old-school SEC rivalry here. High stakes today, Wes, and that's going to make this added interest and added fun for this ball game today, man. I'm excited. I think Gamecock fans are excited. Georgia fans are excited because they feel like they're closing in on a trip to Atlanta. What a story it would be, Wes, if the Gamecocks can find a way to play mistake-free football today and shock the number one team in the nation.
Yeah, man, I'm excited. It's going to be fun. My Gamecock Central subscribers, let me just beg of you, be cool. It may get bad. That doesn't mean the sky is falling. South Carolina is a 20-plus point underdog. Nobody expects the Gamecocks to win this game. So if they pull it off, it's going to be one of the best. Obviously, the biggest upsets in this rivalry's history, one of them. And there's something, Emerson, about when that CBS music hits on a Saturday afternoon.
Yep.
It just screams big time SEC football.
Yep.
I don't want to get too wound up into it or too sentimental, but there's something about it when that CBS music hits that if you're playing on that stage, you might not have arrived yet, but that means you're at least doing something right. So I think that's a sign for the Gamecocks. We'll see what happens, and then we'll talk about it after, huh?
Yep. Like Terrell Owens once said, get your popcorn ready. Gamecocks and Dogs today over in Athens. Wes, let's touch on the point spread real quick before we wrap it up. We got so much to talk about today, I completely forgot about the point spread story. And Georgia opened as a 22.5-point favorite. They just blew out Florida. They've blown out just about everybody they played this year. So I expected it to be a high number. I was a little bit surprised it was that high. And then as soon as the line opened, it shot to 24.5. Like in 24 hours, it was up to 24.5. So, and again, this is just the public's perception of what's going to happen. But early action was on Georgia, pushed that number up to 24.5. And then I think some of the Vegas wise guys came in and said, that's a big number. We're going to take Muschamp and the Gamecocks here. So the line has since dropped back. Right now, as we record, the line is at about 23.5. But a huge number, considering, on paper, this figures to be a pretty good matchup. 8-0 Georgia, 6-2 South Carolina.
Yeah, it was a little bit of a surprise to me. There was like that initial shock. But then when you just look at the pure numbers of how Georgia has beaten these other SEC teams, was it 42-7 against Florida, right? 41-0 at Tennessee?
Yep.
Missouri gave them a scare at the beginning, but then they ended up winning that game handily at the end as well. I think some of it is just when a team has beaten every SEC opponent that handily, that keeps driving that number up. So I don't even know if that's any type of disrespect to the Gamecocks. I think it's just Georgia has beaten up on every SEC opponent they faced so far. So in order to get, enough money actually on South Carolina, that number had to be pretty big. So I wouldn't be surprised if Carolina kept this thing super close and lost. I wouldn't be surprised if Georgia hit that number, to be honest. I know, and I'm not a gambler anyway, but I know I'd stay away from that one. I'd be scared to death of that line either way.
Yeah, I was talking with a buddy of mine earlier this week. We were talking about the line, and we both agreed we thought it was high. And but then after thinking about it for a moment, my buddy said, I wouldn't bet a stick of gum on that game this weekend. So it'll be fun to see how it plays out. 3:30 kick on CBS. Wes, good stuff today, man. A lot of fun for us to be able to talk about a big ball game, this late in the season, particularly with the injuries that the Gamecocks have had this year, man. This is a win-win for South Carolina. You know, I feel like the Gamecocks are playing with house money. If they get blown out today, people will say, well, that's Georgia. They've been blowing everybody out. But if the Gamecocks make a good accounting of themselves and make this a ball game today, they're going to get a lot of national respect because Georgia's the top-ranked team in the college rankings right now.
No doubt. Should be fun, man.
All right, Wes, thanks for your time today, man. Good to talk Gamecock football with you as always. Thank you.
Yes, sir, man. Have a good one.
All right, that's my man Wes Mitchell, Gamecock Insider. Also thanks today to Chris Clark and to Collyn Taylor and to Radi Nabulsi from UGAsports.com. My name's Emerson Phillips, and we thank you for joining us for Gamecock Central's Game Day podcast. Have a great weekend and enjoy the ball game today, friends.